Where on the Street Fighter timeline should Capcom hold the events of Street Fighter VI? We discuss the potential of a venture into the past to feature important and intriguing characters that we've yet to see on any playable roster. Plus, Catalyst meets a big goal with Menat, and we examine what types of Street Fighter V characters seem to do the best in tournament in order to determine what types of characters the game could use in its final DLC season. All on this week's episode of the Event Hubs podcast.
All right, welcome back to another episode of the Event Hubs podcast. I am John Catalyst Gray, and with me as always is John Velociraptor Guerrero.
Hey yo, how's it going, everybody?
It's going pretty darn well. I'm going to answer for everyone. So yeah, it's going better than it was previously. I'm sure some people's heads are still in a bad spot, but we're going to talk about fighting games and try to have some fun with this, and that's where we're at. So.
I have some good news. Yesterday, we, my fiance Brittany and I finalized a venue for our wedding. So now we know where we're going to do it at.
All right, there you go. And is this the one with the open bar?
It is. We'll have 3 hours of open bar.
You're going to regret that. But no, never mind. We'll edit that part out. You didn't hear that. But anyway, so yes, we're definitely looking forward to it. But we did also want to talk about timelines for Street Fighter 6. Like, I know this is something you've been researching. You put up a story on the web. Like, where are you going with this so far?
Yeah, well, okay, so I always like to qualify this because we still have plenty of fuel left in the tank for Street Fighter V, and a lot of people would say, well, we should speculate on that, and we have, and we do, and we will continue to, but at the same time, there's no chance in hell that Capcom isn't beginning to think about, put the puzzle pieces together, put the borders around Street Fighter 6 or whatever their next venture is going to be, and so it's kind of nice to think about that, start getting the discussion slowly but surely out there. Because, hey, maybe they're in a place of development where saying one thing or another might influence them in a certain direction. Who knows? But it's also kind of fun to speculate on. And as I think about this...
just to jump in here, we do have, proof over the years of stuff we suggested, and the community suggested that has gone into these games. It's a consistent thing, and I mean... I would bet several $1,000s and have no issue with it that Street Fighter 6 is currently in development and being worked on. Ono has alluded to as much, and I mean, it's just the way that these games work. You can't just randomly spring up and start a game and have it done in 6 months or whatever. I guess you could, but we've been down those roads before, and
let's not do that.
Yeah, let's not do that. So it's in development now. Whether they call it Street Fighter 6 or Alpha 4, we think it's going to be Street Fighter 6, but these suggestions can carry weight and, get back to Capcom and help them kind of maybe go down some, pathways that they have not anticipated before, or maybe it backs up an idea they have already got or whatever. So we wanted to throw some things out there.
Yes, exactly. So I was thinking about it, and there's plenty of different things they could do with it. They could extend the timeline beyond the forefront, which I believe is the story in Street Fighter 3. I think that's as far as the timeline goes. They're all over the place. But Street Fighter 3 is the chronologically latest one. And then, of course, Street Fighter 1 is the very beginning. I think that's set in 1987, if my research, or my memory from my research serves me correctly. But I was thinking, I'm always gravitating towards the old dudes, Gouken, and when we want DLC characters, Gotetsu pops up in my wish lists quite often. And one of my absolute favorite fights in all of Street Fighter canon, or not even canon, but just all Street Fighter presentation, is the one from the Alpha movie from, I think it was 2005, where Akuma fights Gotetsu. And it's such an epic, amazing, it's an animated show, whatever, but it's really fun. And I realize, there are a lot of characters that we almost already have something of a relationship. Like, we almost know them just because they're so often referenced by the characters that we do regularly see in these games. Chun-Li, for example, always talking about how Bison killed her father and how that's a major motivator for her to do what she's doing. Dan's father, Go, was actually a legitimate fighter, and Dan, sadly and tragically and somewhat comically, is trying to basically fill his father's shoes and accomplish things in his father's name because he was killed at the hands of Sagat, but not before taking Sagat's eye. I would love to explore and see what happened in that particular interaction. And then, of course, I mentioned Gotetsu. So my thought is, what if we went way back in the past and did the timeline back before Street Fighter, where Ryu and Ken, for instance, were too young to be fighting and be part of the roster, given that timeline, and investigate what these older characters might be like, and it'd be really cool because they're gonna echo, for sure, they're gonna echo the kind of characters that we're already used to. Chun-Li's father, for instance, right? He's probably gonna have a few moves that you go, they don't serve the exact same purposes or work in the same ways, but you go, oh, there was like maybe the way Chun-Li was inspired to develop lightning legs or spinning bird kick. Maybe that was from this technique that her father did, and he plays in kind of like an echoey same general idea. But there's so many different interesting routes to go here, and I think that it just generally would be a really cool direction to take the series and explore these older characters.
Yeah, I agree. It's we don't have to look far in multiple forms of media to see that origin stories are a big deal. The Marvel movies, other stuff, like you kind of want to know how your favorite characters got to that point. In the case of like someone like Batman, that origin story's been done so many times. We're like, yeah, you don't have to do that one again. We're good. We understand it. But with the Street Fighter characters, their origin story is like, it's hidden. There's very little that's been documented actually in game. Almost all the stuff comes out of the game. And so just approaching the subject would be huge. And I think a lot of people would enjoy it.
Yeah, for sure. And it also opens up the potential for, you have older characters that are in the lore, right? But maybe you have a handful of other new characters, but they come from familiar places. So like one of the examples here might be, you have T-Hawk, and maybe this is set before T-Hawk's time, but it's like someone from T-Hawk's tribe or village that fights in a similar style, that maybe it was T-Hawk's mentor, maybe a father figure, mother figure, whoever. But you could do something with them, and basically there's plenty of places to go to get already established characters, to get characters that could just be out there in that particular part of the ether, and you could very easily form them based on the themes that they're obviously already surrounded by. Another idea I had was maybe 12 from Street Fighter 3. He's the 12th in a line of experiments, right? Well, maybe you go back down the line and it's from a few years back, and they're on number 3 or something along those lines. Mm-hmm. That might be cool too, and then you could have them be similar to 12 but not the same exact thing. But you can't, as we learned in Street Fighter 3, launch one of these games without having some stable characters in there, like Ryu, like Chun-Li.
Yeah, and I mean, just on that note, Capcom has told us, they're like, we're not going to do a Street Fighter game without Ryu and Chun-Li in it. They have to be in every Street Fighter game we do. And that's just a lesson they learned, as you said, probably from Street Fighter 3. Ryu was in the game from the start, I guess, but Chun-Li was not. She was added later on. And Street Fighter 3 is, generally seen, I know by the fans they love it, but by Capcom and a lot of other people, it's seen as, I don't know if failure is too strong of a word there, but like definitely not the success that Street Fighter 4 and the latter titles have had. I mean, Street Fighter 5, for as much as people knock it, still sold 4.5 million copies on a single console, right? Like there's no Xbox release of this, and it's never going to happen either, and it's still sold 4.5 million copies. That's great. So it's Street Fighter 3 is definitely the least successful of the main Street Fighter entry games that we've had.
Yeah, commercially speaking, right? Like getting people to buy it, not necessarily to play it, but to buy it. And so you'd have to have Ryu and I'd say Chun on your starting roster, and maybe you throw a few other ones just to, depending on dealer's choice at that point. But Capcom has not been very strict at all with their Street Fighter stories, their timelines and whatnot. There's been plenty of retconning. There's been plenty of just flat out change it. Who cares? Case in point was Gouken in Street Fighter 4, right? He was supposed to be dead, but then they're like, well, we want him. We want him on the roster. So you know what? He was just sleeping, and he's been sleeping for a long time, and muscular atrophy isn't a thing. So he wakes up and he's ready to go, and he starts fighting, right? And
actually,
and we were
one of the things they said about that is in Japan, apparently, a character being dead and just showing up you don't need an explanation in Japan. Like they said, like it's just fine apparently. apparently over there.
Oh, does that just happen in Japan?
I guess so. And apparently in America they needed some explanation for him. I forget, he was sleeping the entire time, like he had the power of nothingness or whatever and stuff like that, and he comes back, but his muscles definitely didn't go away. He just was working out hardcore while sleeping or something.
He's ridiculous. He's one of the most ripped characters, and that's saying something in the Street Fighter world, right? So, but the point is, you don't have to do too much. You can finagle things, and you're pretty free to do so, and the priority is to get the characters on the roster that you want over making sure that the story stays consistent. And so, pick your gimmick as to how you're going to get Ryu and Chun back in this particular time. Oh, I should mention this also. It was on this podcast over a year ago, Born Free, my buddy that we haven't seen a ton from recently, but he likes to theorize about this kind of stuff all the time, and he had this basic idea. He said, I'd like to see a Street Fighter Origins where you go back and it's set farther back in the timeline, and you see people like Chun-Li's father and things like that. So a lot of overlap there. This particular idea kind of came up again during our Event Hub's conversations about what we're looking at. Street Fighter 6, is there anything there? What can we speculate on? Oh, this would be kind of cool. And so it kind of came up again, but I'm not the first to kind of explore this space by any means. And Mark Born Free actually put up a video that I would suggest you go check out, because he's got a lot of passion about this stuff, right? And so it's always fun to hear him theorize and speculate on things like this. But anyways, so as far as the story goes, though, he did it by saying that you could just have flashbacks, and then on the main roster, all the characters that were either in the older part of the story or the newer, kind of like, Assassin's Fist, the web series. There was actually 2 timelines that never obviously merged, but you had characters from modern day and you had characters from the flashback, and they just kind of were parallel. And then on the main roster, you just have everybody. You could do it that way. You could also have some kind of a time travel gimmick where the World Warriors have to go back in time for whatever reason. Raiden shows up in a little cameo and takes them back to time.
I hate time travel gimmicks. Unless you're going to base the whole movie on a Back to the Future or something like that, sure, but I just hate it, because it just seems like such a gimmick to get certain things done, and it always feels weird, and I don't know. I don't really like it. But one of the ways I thought they could do it is that they start the games before we've ever seen them start before Street Fighter 1, before Alpha, but just because they start there, it doesn't mean they have to end there, as they could take the storyline through several years of time, and if they wish to get specific characters added to the roster, which we know is a big deal in this day and age with DLC, there's certain characters you just want to have in there. So they could start before the Alpha games took place and advance the story all the way up until Street Fighter 3, which, as you mentioned, that's the end of the timeline as we have it currently. Mm-hmm. And Street Fighter 3's full progression might be too far to go, but as we've seen with Street Fighter 5, you can add elements of Street Fighter 3 in there. And we also know with the MK games, they revisited a number of events, and I don't even think that would be off the table. For me, Ryu is one of the most popular characters in video games. Not just fighting games, video games. He is one of the biggest characters, and his origin story has never been told properly in game. That is mind-blowing to me. All this lore, all this other kind of stuff, we know it came from comic books and movies and other things, a little bit in game, but not a lot. He's kind of a finished product by the time we see him in these games usually. He basically just shows up in fights, and having a strong origin story for one of the biggest characters in video games is a no-brainer. Why have you not done this? You throw in people like Akuma, Ken, Guile, Chun-Li, and other stuff, their stories are a little bit more fleshed out, but these are gigantic video game characters, and just solidly telling their story in-game. The key word here is in-game, should be immensely popular with fans.
There's plenty of opportunity to do with the story what Mortal Kombat or NRS has done with their stories, right? Or make it a bigger selling point. People are already enthralled with the Street Fighter story. They follow it. They can tell you, Blanka was created by eels or whatever, and all the different variations and such. But people are already excited because it's sort of a tangential thing to something that people care about to begin with very passionately, and so there's already a certain sense of intrigue and charisma that it gets just by being what it is, but it certainly hasn't it needs to be refurbished and paid a lot more attention to and watered and nurtured and grown, and there's a lot that you could do here that would resonate with people that they would really appreciate if you took the time to do it. Now again, I started this little segment, this process here with saying that it's not that important because we haven't made it important before. Capcom hasn't made it important before, and with my objectives here, it's more to get certain characters or have access to certain characters in a Street Fighter game. That still is my top priority, and like I said, I don't personally really care how they do it with the story. I don't need a story at all, but I'm not the majority there, and I know there's a lot of people that do care very much about that, and I can appreciate.
You can't look at NRS's sales and say that story is not important anymore in fighting games. Anyone that is a business developer, like they work on the business side of fighting games, and they look at that, is a freaking moron if they don't see that the story mode for these games is extremely important. You need to get in there. You need to nail it. I mean, again, I get that Street Fighter V was like, pretty questionable on the quality. I enjoyed it. I know a few other people did, but at least it was there eventually. They eventually got it into the game. Most people realize that you need to do this at some point, and do it well. And if you do it well, you can get like the 10 million in sales that NRS is like pulling in, I think, almost per title now. I don't know how much MK11 has done, but again, these guys do incredibly well with their story modes, and people want it. It's dramatic proof that people want it, but yeah.
And we saw a drastic change for the better in this direction with what Street Fighter V did with his story compared to previous ones, right? Which were just kind of walls of text or like a slideshow or maybe some brief animation clips, but nothing like a Shadow Falls, which was this whole cinematic story. Now, was it executed very well? It was forgettable, except for that I know Zangief broke a sword with his chest hair. But, I mean, it's a step in the right direction. And you could absolutely make one of those on this level where you have the conflict between Go Hibiki and young Sagat, right? Like that would be super cool, and maybe it's the sequence where Go takes Sagat's eye, but it's not quite where Sagat actually kills him yet, or something like that, right? Or maybe Gen and Chun-Li's father, because from what I recall, Gen was one of the people that trained Chun. If that's correct, maybe Gen and Chun-Li's father meet before Chun's old enough, right, or before she's born, and they have some kind of agreement where if something happens to me, please train my daughter, or something like something behind the scenes. There's plenty of stuff that you could flesh out that would be very interesting.
There's an insane amount. Just one thing to throw out there: it's been done in the game before, but Bison killing Nash or Charlie, whatever you want to call him, like that was done before in the alpha games, but it's like it was done with a few slides and like a helicopter comes up and shoots him or whatever and stuff. I mean, it's very basic. Like you could actually have that be a whole narrative, and like Guile, Bison, and Nash are three gigantic characters in this franchise, and like even that alone could take up a whole story mode. Like there's so much material here that they could work with that has never been touched before, and all the stuff you're saying too, it's like my head is exploding with like how much stuff, like even Blanca like falling out of the plane or doing whatever, like, and falling into the jungle, like seeing that happen when he was Jimmy, I guess, right? Like, I mean, it would be sad, but it would also be kind of cool to see like his origin. But yeah.
Yeah, so I didn't want to put too much of a parameter around this because, again, I'm just aimed at getting this basic idea going. But I did do some actual research where you looked at dates and you looked at timelines and such. And so what I found was that Street Fighter 1, which is where the story sort of begins, is in 1987. And my idea here was that I wanted Ryu and Ken to be a little bit too young to be able to participate in the as their modern day. As they appear in modern day, but of course if you were to gimmick them from the future or something like that, you could have them fight in that form. But as far as the timeline goes, too young for them, which means that if it's 1975, there's a handful of birth dates out there, and I think Bison would be 21, Sagat would be 20, and then like Dalsim's like 28, something like that. But you could have those kinds of characters, and then you could also have the kind of timeless characters. So Oro is an ancient hermit. he could be around very easily for that.
Yeah.
Gen was born in, I think, 1921 or something like that, so he'd still be something like 50 years old, something like that. Q has no backstory, so hey, Q could be around, who knows?
Definitely. And one thing to be very clear with too is Capcom stripped all the birth years out of their lore. Basically, I don't know exactly when it happened. I want to say it was like around the Street Fighter 3 era or something, but they used to put birth dates in there and they completely retconned all those out. So there's some wiggle room for them to do kind of whatever they want to do, and I think one of the reasons how come they did that is like Ryu and Chun-Li now would be about 60 years old or mid 60s or something like that. It's a little hard to get like too amped up about like a bunch of 60-year-old fighters duking it out, so there's some reasons how come they did that, so there's a flexibility.
Yeah. That'd be funny though. Like this just really old Street Fighter. Hey, that next week's podcast, we'll explore that.
There you go.
I did this story and it's got plenty of discussion in the comment section as people respond to it, liking it or not liking it. One of the threads that I'm seeing pop up more often than most is I put Ingrid on the potential list of characters, which I thought would be good. One, because if you go back, there are not a lot of female characters in the older stories. Like the masters or the parental figures, it's a lot of men. So I'm trying to balance that out, because if you launched a roster with like one or no female characters, I don't think people would accept that very much either. So I'm going through trying to find like where I can find legitimate instances where I can put a female character in, and Ingrid pops up because she's a goddess, right? But people do not suddenly want Ingrid, and like that's weird to me, because whenever we post fan art and such, when there's an Ingrid one, people usually hone in on that and talk about how excited they are about her and how much they love her. But when I put it in this story, man, people did not want her. And yes, I know she's not officially canon. That does not matter to me at all. We've had Evil Ryu for forever, and plus all the stuff that I just spoke about Capcom not really caring and retconning and all that stuff. It's like Ingrid's just fine. She passes the test to be on here, but apparently not by fan preference standards.
Yeah, it's you kind of either like her or hate her, I think, because she's very polarizing, oddly enough.
Is there a reason?
I don't know.
I never played as Ingrid or against her. Like, I didn't play that game.
Yeah, she was only like in Alpha 3 Max. Like, she's not in Alpha 3 proper. She was only in, I think that's it anyway. And that's like, it was like a portable version of the game or whatever. And I'm like, I've never followed her that closely, so I never got the hype surrounding her. Circling back here to give more evidence that Capcom would be interested in this timeline, all the official Street Fighter Assassin's Fist content I could find is not public on YouTube anymore. They had to take it down. I don't know where the rights are at or what's going on with it. I remember myself just really enjoying the series, and then like the critics and the fans all seemed to really enjoy it. Like it was well received overall, and from what I could see, it had 6.5 million views on it. That's pretty good, especially for content like you can't find on the web anymore. And I don't even know exactly when it was stripped down. I think it was a couple years ago, but regardless. And then back before Capcom re-released Super Street Fighter 2 HD Remix, the lead designer of the game, David Sirlin, he mentioned there was a large amount of support for doing Street Fighter Alpha 3 instead, re-releasing that game. This was actually one of Capcom's biggest selling franchises in the late 90s, with 1 million copies sold on the PlayStation 1. That gives you people an idea that like fighting games are really big right now. I don't know if they're as big as they've ever been, but they're definitely very large. They're probably bigger than they ever been because there's just more gamers out there right now, right? But anyway, the reason I bring this up is we know there was internal support for a re-release of Alpha 3, so it adds a bit more weight to the theory that Capcom might be a little more fond of this timeline, the older timeline, internally. I'm not saying it makes it a lock for Street Fighter 6, just that we know there's some internal support for a game that exists in this timeline, and it could make a lot of sense for him. So I personally feel like, again, just starting there and then actually revisiting each entry along the way in terms of the storyline and such would be epic. And you only focus on the people who have really cool storylines. Sorry, Dudley people out there who want to see Gil steal his car and make him enter the tournament. We're not going to go into that one. But like Alex coming up and, being like this kind of like hype character who's like, the protagonist of Street Fighter 3, and like Oro, and like the main core storyline, like the real highlights of each game, and exploring those like with a chapter for each one. So like chapter 1 is Street Fighter 1 and chapter 2 is Alpha, and so forth and so on. Like we would get to revisit Street Fighter 4, we get to revisit Street Fighter 3, and basically do a greatest hits version of Street Fighter that we've never had before, and just kind of blow it out of the water and make it a great epic story mode. And I will say now, that's pretty ambitious, and whether Capcom could do it well, that's up for debate. Hopefully they'd hire some outside people to punch up the script and the execution of it if they feel like they're not up to the task. NRS has developed an amazing team at this, and Capcom clearly knows how to do it in their other divisions with Resident Evil and Devil May Cry. This should be entirely reasonable for a goal for them to pull off, to have excellent single-player campaign for people to play through. It's just, there's kind of like, at this point in time, there should be no excuse. Like, just delay the game for a little bit longer, get that single-player campaign in there, make it as epic as you can. Don't do, hey, Bison, he has white hair, we're totally going to tell you about that, and then not mention it at all. Why does Ken look that way? Did he get in a car accident like he got in the Malibu like comics and stuff like that, where Balrog beat him up or something? Like, what happened? Don't explain it at all. Like, it's just, there's so much stuff they just did not touch. Don't ever do that again. It's give us an epic storyline. I don't really this is my preference. I'd love to see a greatest hits version because it's never been done before in terms of just telling Street Fighter story properly. But I'm also like, I don't know if that's too ambitious for what Capcom is capable of.
Why would it be too ambitious? Because it's starting to sound, okay, this isn't apples to apples, but it's starting to sound like what they did with the arcade mode in Street Fighter V. They broke that up across the different games, right? And then you can play as the characters from those eras in those arcade modes. Expand this out to the story mode, and then of course it also applies to the game's roster in general, so it's a very wide berth. But we're seeing this kind of thing happen more and more. Larger launch rosters. I bring up Smash Bros. That's kind of an anomaly, and it's out there in the fringe. But hey, they did it, and they did it with like 70 characters. So and when we're talking Capcom, this AAA Street Fighter fighting games, I think that it's not too much to ask of them.
It's too much to ask if you look at their history. And that's what I'm afraid of. Just like you said about Street Fighter V story mode, Zangief, the most memorable moment is him blocking a katana blade with his chest hair. And it's like, that's one of the things that sticks out to all of us. And there's like something going on with chess pieces and the moon, and like the moon is like the Death Star or whatever. And it's like, what? Like, what is even happening with all this stuff? Like, and a coherent storyline that's actually capable of being followed and all this kind of stuff. Like, I think Capcom owned it from the get-go. Ono actually talked about Street Fighter V story mode and said, look, we're not going to be as good as NRS. And he has cited NRS as just being, excellent at what they do. He has flat out said that. And I mean, NRS didn't even start with like the gold standard, like Mortal Kombat 9, which a lot of people look back on as being like kind of like where fighting games really took off. It was actually Mortal Kombat versus DC where they started doing the story mode type stuff. And then, of course, people remember MK9 because it was done so well. Well, I'm kind of hoping that history can kind of repeat itself there with Street Fighter V, where it started there with Capcom, but Street Fighter 6 kind of like puts it over the top. But I mean, man, Capcom scares me.
Yeah, and I hear you 100% there. I'm living in La La Land and Fantasy Potential Land, where everything gets done the best way it can. But as I think about NRS, and I played through the MK9 or MK2011 story. I don't remember a ton out of it, but what I remember was it was impressive in presentation. It was impressive because it wasn't what I was expecting. I was expecting just something like the walls of text and the few slides after you beat the game. I wasn't expecting this whole story. Now that said, I don't remember much of the specifics of it. As far as a story goes, it didn't move me in very many emotional directions and such. That in and of itself, I mean, that's already been imitated by Street Fighter with A Shadow Falls here, right? In Street Fighter V. They've already kind of done that. And the story itself, like, well, that's not new anymore. If Capcom were the first to do that, like if they had launched A Shadow Falls or something like it before we saw NRS do their thing, I think it would have been a bigger splash. The next place to go with it, though, because they can already do that, and maybe they'll up their graphics or whatever, but that's not going to have a lot of impact at this point. What's going to work and what's going to make a story mode memorable now that the glitz and glam of having the updated cinematic presentation be a thing, it's going to come down to if it moves you. And I think the best way to do that is to focus on character interaction, right? Focus not on, oh, there's a giant laser that's going to blow up the world. How do we stop it? Well, we fight Bison now. Okay, and then there's a fight with Bison. But getting back to the most compelling parts of this is like the relationship, the competition between Ryu and Ken, and how Ken usually beats Ryu, but then Ryu's, like divided or conflicted and battling the Dark Hado inside, and Ken's more off like to go be a family man, and then like how do those two different approaches, how do they interact once these two come together in the wilderness to fight and train with each other? What we talked about earlier with Go Hibiki and his legacy, and his son watching while he fights Sagat, and Sagat at this point would be evil and part of Shadaloo's base, and then Sagat has a story arc. Actually, as I think about Street Fighter V, when when Kage came out or when Sagat came out, one of those two, there's the pre-story mode that actually is kind of interesting. It has to do with there's the benevolence of Sagat, or he fights with Kage and he says something really insightful, and I mean, I don't remember it enough to recall it directly, but it left a lasting impact on me. And with where we're going here, with where we're starting, we're going back to the origins of these characters, to parts of the story that have already repeatedly got our attention. They resonate with us already. So you've already sort of done the foundational work. These are the laces are there, just tie them now together, go back and tie them, flesh out the details. But you already have the foundations of a story that people are interested in hearing. So you've got yourself set up. Just kick the ball now, Charlie Brown. Just go for it.
And I agree with you. It's not that simple, but I mean, it can be done. It's just, and I look back at Capcom having so much success with Street Fighter 4, and one of the ways they hyped up the game was that it was returned to their Street Fighter 2 roots. That is how they marketed a lot. They weren't going to go even more complex than Street Fighter 3. They weren't going to do that. They're like, no, we're going to actually bring the game's execution and a bunch of other things way back down. That's how they marketed Street Fighter 4 very heavily. And I would, less on the execution thing, but I would like to see Street Fighter 6 be a return to their story roots. Have hey, here's the origin story of all these characters you love that have never been told properly, and told in a way that's excellent and going to bring you in. And then I mean, it's Capcom. They do a great job with the gameplay every time out. I know some people want to debate that, but guess what? Their games are always played. They're always some of the highest entrance games in tournaments and other stuff like that. They take on a life of themselves pretty much every single numbered entry in a Street Fighter game. I have yet to see one that has not taken off in the community and done very well. Alpha 3 might be a little bit of an exception. Alpha 1, I get it, but they were still played at least for some time, right?
Yeah.
It's Capcom's history of doing great with their gameplay is pretty darn evident. That's not the stuff I worry about. I worry about the surrounding things, and I would really love to see them do something great with Street Fighter 6.
Yeah. Man, one of the things that immediately jumps out to me is the charm of seeing where these moves came from, so and we got that with Goken, because he was doing Tatsus and he was doing fireballs and such, but they were his own style, where you could see where they came from, but they certainly didn't function in the same way that Ryu's or Ken's or even Akuma's did, right?
Yeah.
And then so you have Akuma and Goken's movesets. They got stuff like the Demon Flip and Tatsus and fireballs, and sometimes air fireballs. You had to what did Gotetsu, what was his actual arsenal that he taught them that was the starting point for this? There's a charm to that, and I'm intrigued with it.
Cool. It's that foundation is, there's so much mystery, and finally having that revealed, man, I would play the shogun out of that. I would just I'm I want that right now, kind of thing. Make me, I will pay double price to get that crap right now. I'll buy it 5 times. I don't care, kind of thing. Give me that. I want that so bad. And I mean, there's proof of that. There's a lot of gamers out there that want that. It's never been done before, and just do it. But yeah,
for sure.
All right, so moving on here, I did want to give a shout out here to John, my co-host, and then Steven Dream King, because with their help, I was able to make it into the top 10 on CFN for Monop players. I was very stoked, because that's a goal of mine here before all the DLC comes out. Hint, hint for Street Fighter V, that may make me change my main for some reasons I'm not going to get into. But the reason I bring this up is to talk about setting your own personal goals. Most people who pick up a guitar aren't expecting to become the best person who ever touched an instrument, right? You can find a lot of satisfaction and enjoyment in just measuring your own progress. Learning to play a few songs at parties and to sing with friends and all that other kind of stuff, that's satisfying. It's fun. It's enjoyable. And I look at fighting games in a very similar fashion. I'm not looking to go win EVO or go win Capcom Cup or anything like that. Like, it would be nice, but I know I don't have the time to put into those type of things. So I'm setting up goals for myself that I think I can reasonably achieve, and like, they're enjoyable to me, right? And making it to the top 10 on the CFN before the new DLC came out was a huge goal of mine. And it was like, and I'm stoked that I hit it. And this is just a reminder out there to everyone listening that set your own reasonable goals for yourself, and it's a fun way to measure your progress in these games, and just kind of enjoy the ride. Like, don't measure yourself up against Punk or Tokido or Daigo or anyone like that. Like, that's too far for most people, unless you know your goal is to win Capcom Cup. Like, then go ahead. But if it's not, if you're just there to, like, you know, get into a new, you know, rank, or to have like a 10 win streak or do something like that, that's a perfectly reasonable goal and a fun way to really approach these games.
Yeah, and I would even say divide your goals into smaller ones that you can see and check off as you go. I think I've talked about that before, but that's immensely helpful. So make make some longer term goals for like a month from now, make a goal for this week, make a goal for today, and make them all reasonable for the time frames, because it's really nice to see the progress. That's where the dopamine drip or the serotonin drip, I don't know which one applies to this situation directly, but that's where the good feels come from that continue to motivate you to get back on tomorrow and continue in the next day and actually make that change happen. So do it that way is my recommendation. And also congrats. You know, it's funny. We were talking about John was talking about it because he was number 11 when he had last played, and he's like, I'm only like, what did you say, like 50,000 away or something like that? It was a lot.
I was like 4,000 or 5,000 points away from getting to 50,000 or something.
Oh, I see. Okay, so it wasn't away from getting into top 10, because that didn't really check out. So thanks for clarifying that. Yeah. But he was number 11, and we were talking about it. I think it was yesterday or the day before. Yeah. I think it was yesterday. And then you went and checked, and the person that was number 10 had just had a bad day or something and ended up dropping down to 11. Yeah. And we're like, oh no, we got it. It's already good. We're there. Yeah. So sometimes you get your goals without doing anything. You know, let your opponent hang themselves, so to speak. So
I in my defense, I did actually go on like a few 13, 14 game win streaks and stuff to get up to that point total.
That wasn't meant to at all rain on that. Like, you got there, that 100%, and that's part of the way you get there. And now you have to maintain it too, at least until another character that I don't know who is going to be, but I mean, if another character comes out that grabs your attention, then you'll have to go play with her or him. Yeah. But in the meantime, you gotta maintain, or else Steven and I are going to give you a lot of crap.
Oh yeah. Yeah, it's I'll try to do my best, but again, you have good days, you have bad days, and sometimes you progress more than you realize, and you check it and you're like, oh crap, I achieved my goal without, I didn't see that coming. So anyway, getting into our next thing here, I broke down the tournament tough characters by category to see what style isn't as represented in tournament play as some other ones. And right off the bat, I want to say that the style you'd assume to be the most dominant in Street Fighter V actually is, and that's rushdown play. You know, that's definitely, as people would expect. But in terms of who Capcom might be adding, though, in Street Fighter V, it's not as important as how they make them play. We've seen a number of characters kind of come into this game and we had this expectation of how they were going to play, and they actually changed them up quite a bit, right? So this is just a theory of mine of how Capcom might look to address some of the Street Fighter V's needs while adding specific playstyles in for Season 5. So I grouped characters into 3 categories: Rushdown, Zoning, and Grappler. Characters were sorted for where they primarily got their wins, and they're the most efficient at. For example, someone like Akuma is capable of zoning for some parts of the match, but his results have mainly come from him rushing down and mixing people up. So I gave him the rushdown category.
Okay.
And I get that I'm painting this with fairly broad strokes here, but I thought on a basic level this matches up with the community's perception of the game. And filling in niches of gameplay that aren't as heavily represented is a thing we know developers look at. As they've said many times through the years, that having a variety of styles and approaches is obviously very important to fighting games. We don't all want to play Ryu matches all day long, right? We want to have some other variety going with it. So,
sure.
So yeah. Also, I didn't include characters who might fill a certain playstyle, like establishing that playstyle, like Falk, because the bottom line is, even though this character is technically a zoning playstyle, it doesn't mean they're highly effective at it are considered highly effective at it by the community. I wanted to make a list which I feel represents how the community feels about the game at high levels. And so with that in mind, to include a character on my list, I want them to have either won tournaments or have been a regular threat to have done so from Season 2 onwards. So that means that there are easy locks like Karen and Rashid, obviously, but someone like Ed I did not include because his tournament track record is terrible. Characters like Ryu and Nash, who were once strong in Season 1, but they're pretty much balls right now. They were not included either, so I did not include them. And so I got down from 40 characters, or 41 styles, to actually 23 characters, or 24 styles, counting Zeku twice because he has 2 stances which have 2 different styles with them.
I see.
So going through this here, out of the 23 characters with 24 different styles, Zeku's in there. Not surprisingly, Rushdown, as I mentioned before, came out the highest with 13 characters total, while Zoning had 7 and the Grapplers had 4. The Grappler archetype is usually pretty niche to begin with. With the majority of Grapplers in Street Fighter V, they're actually very effective. Like, it's shocking. Like, Capcom has not made too many Grappler types that just completely suck and don't work. Like, you've seen them either regularly win tournaments or do well, and we're talking about Zangief, Abigail, Laura, Mika. Those are all, those characters are at least at the very worst a threat to win the tournament. It's very uncommon to not see them kind of up there and doing something. And Grapplers are a very niche kind of group to begin with. Like, in most fighting games, you usually only have a handful of Grapplers. And so the fact that the Grapplers Capcom already has, they're all highly effective, it makes me think that there's not really a need to add more Grappler characters in the game. You could see it.
That's also a style we talk about as, like, I don't know if it's volatile or you don't want your grapplers to be the best characters in the game traditionally, right? Mm-hmm. Because they wind up being too much of the, it's weird, and I don't even feel super qualified to talk about it because I don't understand it exactly, but you don't want grapplers to be the best a lot of times because they're so 50-50 based or reads based, and it just doesn't feel like, but there is a place for them in the game. Like, we're not upset that a grappler's in the game. That means it's a random scrub fest or whatever, but there's something about them that they're you use them sparingly, and you got to use them correctly, or else they can be issues.
Mm-hmm. Now, there's debate on if Birdie is truly a grappler or what he is. I personally put him as Rushdown, as that's typically what he's doing the most damage in, like where he's most efficient. Like, he can get stuff off of his grabs, but it's not his grabs that really put the fear of God into you, right? He's more of a hybrid character than most, but I give the edge towards a Rushdown. So how I categorize different things, like, it's up for debate. I get that, but...
so Birdie's a Rushdown, but Abigail's a grappler?
Yes, that's exactly how I have it, yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So I'm going to get a bunch of crap for that. Thank you for pointing out that different stuff. But no, I get it. It's there's a few fringe cases, but I think overall the numbers kind of match up pretty well there. But the Street Fighter franchise is known for trying to keep a balance between offense and defense. So I could see Capcom trying to address this even more in Season 5, the final year of the game, by adding a few more zoning types into the game. Hopefully, some of them actually end up being tournament viable and they properly impact the game, unlike Falk did. So I feel there's about 6 more Rushdown style characters in zoning right now, and I think this means we might see more of a Zoners edition with this last batch of DLC to try to address that imbalance in the game. So there are a couple ways of addressing balance in games. One of them is system mechanics and universal things. And I feel like Street Fighter V is kind of at the end of its life in that regard. I don't know if we're going to see like a red focus or anything else. I mean, it could happen, and that's definitely a way of addressing the meta of these games. But another is having characters who are strong represent certain styles of play. Like if you have if your top 10 is mostly Rushdown, your game is going to be seen as mostly Rushdown. And if your top 10 is mostly zoning, we saw this again in Street Fighter 4. In Super Street Fighter 4, zoning was very strong in that edition of the game, and the game was seen as very defensive and very neutral and stuff like that. And again, that's Capcom's history. They try to get a balance between both things. And since again the system mechanics are probably done, I feel like the best way of doing that would be kind of like a Zoners Edition DLC pack. But yeah, it's just kind of a fun theory I'm throwing out there. It's not like this is an exact science and this is exactly what's going to happen, but I'm like, oh yeah, this would make sense to try to like even things up a little bit if they went this way.
So do you think that would mean that they'd be influenced to select certain characters because of their playstyle as opposed to because of their popularity?
I would think that they would be influenced to alter how those characters play based to fill needs and whatnot. Because I mean, we've seen so many characters come into this game and they play not entirely different, but fairly dramatically different than they have in the past. And I don't think that Capcom is too afraid to do that still.
I am not very familiar with Oro, and he's a character that's been coming up since the beginning of this game as potential DLC. From what I've seen, he can like kind of zone you with floaty rocks and fireballs, but he also has a command grab. And what kind of character is he? Would you put him, or like what?
I mean, if we're talking,
what was he in Street Fighter 3?
He was a control zoning character. He had some of the other stuff in there, but he mostly was going to do a lot of mix-ups, like with his head stomps and other things. But I mean, it didn't come as like a constant rushdown type thing. There were very few like just constant rushdown characters in Street Fighter 3 to begin with. The game was extremely neutral based and defensive.
Mm-hmm. So would he be that route if they were to bring him into Street Fighter 5? Do you think he'd be like a control zoner and exactly what you're saying that the game needs right now? Or do you think that they could tweak him in a different direction and make him something else?
He's pretty wide open because he's so powerful. He has a really diverse moveset. I mean, Capcom could go any way they wanted to with him. And I mean, they're not afraid to completely alter moves or remove moves from the game for certain characters. So it could go any way. But I mean, again, I think that this pack is going to be more tilted towards zoning than other packs have been.
And that goes right along with your theory that Makoto would be too Street Fighter 5 for Street Fighter 5's own good, right? And she'd just be all about that rush down, all about the get up in your face and 50-50s, and people have had enough of that. So maybe not the first pick, even though she's number 2 on the popularity poll, only behind Sakura.
Yeah.
To me, the character choices right now, if I'm Capcom from where I can see things, I would just try to make the fans that are still playing the game happy. I wouldn't be trying to bring newcomers in, and I'm not saying that your approach would be to do this. I think that your approach technically plays on this as well. But the first place my mind goes is just like, if we bring so-and-so in just because of who they are, is that going to get people more hyped to play the game? Or, I mean, those that you used to play then don't anymore to come back, things like that. Like, those would be the boxes I'd be trying to check from my point of view. But I do think that people consider this sort of stuff. And right now, the competition mindset isn't so much there because we're not having competitions. I mean, there's some online stuff, and we've got whatever the EVO exhibition is going to be coming up. But really, we're not thinking as competitively minded right now. We're not getting the regular updates. We're not seeing who's winning and such, and we're not complaining about so-and-so because they keep getting first place or whatever. That part of the puzzle is temporarily gone right now, and so I think that's also going to impact how people process your new content as it comes down the pike.
I agree.
But all that said, what you're saying there's a lot to it. It feels that people, maybe I'm just not giving the benefit of the doubt, but it feels like people will analyze things on a fairly surface level. So like what immediately makes them excited. And so obviously the identity of a character is going to be like the number one thing there. And what you're talking about is a few rungs down, and you have to have a little bit of vision down the way in order to be concerned about that kind of stuff. I would like to see it. I would like to see the game just get more balanced out. There